The clock on the mahogany wall clicked over to 10 a.m. just as the conference room door closed behind the last member of my family. No one spoke. The silence felt expensive. Heavy leather chairs surrounded a polished walnut table that reflected the morning sunlight pouring through windows overlooking downtown Atlanta. Fresh lilies filled crystal vases, their sweet fragrance almost masking the scent of old paper and coffee. Almost. My grandfather believed punctuality was a form of respect. Even after his death, his attorney honored that belief without exception. "I think we're ready," the attorney said, adjusting his glasses before opening a thick black portfolio. My father leaned back with the confidence of a man who had already decided the outcome. My mother folded her designer handbag onto her lap and offered my younger sister, Danielle, a reassuring smile. Danielle smiled back. She always did. Growing up, she had been the family's bright light while I was expected to disappear quietly into the background. People complimented her beauty before asking my name. My parents called her our little star. I became the daughter who solved problems. She became the daughter everyone celebrated. Even now, nothing had changed. Danielle caught my eye across the table. "I hope you're not expecting too much," she whispered with a smile that never reached her eyes. I smiled politely. "I never do." She laughed softly. To everyone else, it sounded affectionate. I knew better. The attorney cleared his throat. "As executor of the estate of James Carter, I will now read the final testament." Every heartbeat seemed louder than the last. The estate totaled $18,450,000, including investment accounts, commercial real estate, privately held company shares, and family trust assets. It represented generations of work, generations of sacrifice, generations of dreams. My father straightened his tie before the reading even began. He already looked victorious. What none of them realized was that my grandfather had spent years teaching me something far more valuable than confidence. He taught me patience. The attorney began reading specific distributions. My mother would receive a lifetime residence allowance. My father would retain an executive advisory position within the family companies. Danielle inherited several investment accounts along with ownership interests in multiple properties. Every announcement widened their smiles. Every page seemed to confirm exactly what they had expected. I listened without moving, without reacting, without interrupting. Finally, the attorney reached the final page. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. He looked toward me, then back at the document. He cleared his throat again. Regarding Naomi Carter, the room became perfectly still. The estate provides no direct inheritance. Silence. Absolute silence. Then Danielle released a tiny laugh she tried and failed to hide. My father exhaled through his nose as if confirming something he had believed all along. Mother slowly shook her head. "I'm sure your grandfather had his reasons," she said gently. The words sounded comforting. They weren't. They were a verdict. Danielle crossed one leg over the other. "I guess success isn't always enough." Father nodded once. "Sometimes relationships matter more than careers." No one looked surprised. Not even me. I folded my hands together and met the attorney's eyes. "Thank you," I said calmly. The room seemed confused by my response. "You understand?" The attorney asked carefully. "I understand exactly what was read." I stood, smoothing the sleeve of my navy blazer. "I appreciate your time." Father frowned. "That's it?" I looked at him. "What else would you like me to do?" He had no answer. Danielle smiled with quiet satisfaction. Mother looked relieved that I wasn't making a scene. They expected anger. They expected tears. They expected me to fight over money. Instead, I picked up my bag. The leather handle felt cool in my hand. Every step toward the door echoed softly across the hardwood floor. Behind me, Conversation immediately returned. Danielle was already talking about renovation ideas for one of the inherited properties. Father discussed investment strategies. Mother mentioned a celebration dinner. They were already spending wealth they believed belonged to them forever. They had absolutely no idea. My hand rested on the brass doorknob when the attorney called my name. Miss Carter. I turned. He walked toward me carrying a small cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. This was left with very specific instructions. He lowered his voice until only I could hear him. I was told to give this to you only after today's reading. I accepted it carefully. Across the front, written in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting, were 8 words. Open only after they celebrate. I looked back once. Laughter had already filled the conference room. No one noticed me anymore. No one asked where I was going. They thought they had won. Quietly, I slipped the envelope into my bag and walked out into the cool autumn air. For the first time that morning, I allowed myself the smallest smile. Because inside that envelope was one sentence that would destroy everything they believed they owned. People often assume betrayal begins with one terrible decision. Mine didn't. It arrived quietly, one family dinner at a time, one comparison after another, until I stopped expecting love and started expecting conditions. Looking back now, I can see every warning sign. I just didn't know they were leading to a lawyer's conference room where I would hear my own name followed by the word nothing. Growing up, Danielle and I shared a bedroom for almost 8 years. We shared toys, clothes, and birthdays that were only 3 weeks apart. What we never shared was the way our parents looked at us. Whenever relatives visited, my mother would straighten Danielle's hair and smooth the front of her dress before opening the door. Then she would glance at me. Naomi, maybe stand in the back for the pictures. She always had a reason. The sunlight is too bright. You look tired. Let your sister be in front this time. When I was 12, I finally understood the real reason. An aunt hugged Danielle and smiled. She has such beautiful light skin. She photographs just like your mother. Everyone laughed. No one corrected her. I stood there holding a tray of lemonade, pretending I hadn't heard a single word. That afternoon changed something inside me. Not because strangers noticed the difference. Because my parents never denied it. As I grew older, the comparisons became less subtle. Danielle earned applause for trying. I earned silence for succeeding. When she graduated from college, my father rented a ballroom and invited nearly 200 guests. When I graduated from law school with honors, we celebrated with takeout containers at the kitchen table because, according to him, you're already working too hard to care about parties. I smiled anyway. I had learned that disappointment was easier to carry when no one knew you were carrying it. My mother called it keeping the peace. Loyal families don't embarrass each other. She would remind me whenever I questioned anything. If your father says something hurtful, let it go. If Danielle interrupts you, let it go. If people overlook you, let it go. Over time, let it go became another way of saying, accept your place. So I did something they never expected. I stopped asking them to see me. Instead, I poured every ounce of energy into becoming someone I respected. Law school became my refuge. Contracts made sense. Trust law made sense. Corporate governance rewarded preparation instead of popularity. The rules didn't change because someone preferred another daughter. The law cared about evidence, not favoritism. That lesson became the foundation of my career. Ironically, it also came from the one person who treated me differently. My grandfather. To everyone else, our Saturday lunches looked ordinary. We would eat fried catfish at a small neighborhood restaurant before walking through downtown together. People assumed an old man simply wanted company. They had no idea those afternoons were an education. Granddad never lectured. He asked questions. What gives a contract strength? Why does a board have fiduciary duties? Who really owns wealth, the person holding the money or the person controlling the paperwork? At first, I answered poorly. He smiled every time. Good, he would say. Now let's learn why. Years later, I realized he wasn't teaching me to become a lawyer. He was teaching me how powerful quiet preparation could become. One afternoon, he handed me a thick binder. No title. No explanation. Inside were articles about trusts, governance, succession planning, and family businesses that had collapsed because pride replaced discipline. Read one section every week, he told me. You'll understand later. He was right. I just didn't know how much later. Meanwhile, my parents had discovered a new favorite person. Richard Holloway. Richard arrived wearing tailored suits, expensive watches, and the effortless confidence of someone accustomed to walking into rooms where everyone already admired him. He was a successful real estate investor with luxury developments across several states. At least, that was the story he told. My father repeated it constantly. Mother called him a visionary. Danielle laughed at every joke he made. Richard seemed fascinated by our family's holdings. Commercial buildings, rental properties, investment accounts, historic land that had appreciated for decades. He complimented my grandfather's business instincts while casually suggesting the portfolio was underperforming. There are smarter ways to grow wealth, he said during one family dinner. My father leaned forward immediately. I'm listening. I wasn't. I was watching. Good lawyers spend less time hearing words than studying the people speaking them. Richard rarely answered direct questions directly. He preferred impressive phrases over precise explanations. That alone made me cautious. Then he looked at me. And what do you do again, Naomi? I'm a corporate attorney. He smiled politely. The pause lasted just long enough. So, paperwork. Danielle laughed. Mother smiled into her wineglass. Richard continued. No offense, but lawyers usually slow business down. I returned his smile. Sometimes that's exactly what keeps businesses alive. He chuckled as though I had made an innocent joke. Cute paperwork. The words floated around the table. Everyone laughed except my grandfather. He simply looked down at his coffee cup. For only a second. But I noticed. His expression didn't show amusement. It showed recognition, as though Richard had just confirmed something he had suspected all along. No one else caught it. They were too busy imagining larger profits and faster growth. They thought Richard was their opportunity. I thought he was asking far too many questions about assets that didn't belong to him. And what they didn't know is that my grandfather never trusted Richard for a single day. Chapter 3. The clause they never read. The elevator doors closed behind me with a soft metallic whisper, shutting out the voices, smiles, and congratulations that had filled the conference room only minutes earlier. I stood alone as the elevator descended, staring at my reflection in the polished steel doors. My expression looked calm, but my chest felt impossibly heavy. Outside, the October air carried a sharp chill that settled against my skin. Downtown traffic moved around me as though nothing remarkable had happened. Cars honked. A bus stopped at the corner. Two strangers laughed over coffee. Meanwhile, I had just been erased from my grandfather's will. At least, that was what everyone believed. My apartment overlooked the city from the 22nd floor. It wasn't extravagant, but every piece of furniture had been earned through years of impossible hours, difficult clients, and relentless determination. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and finally allowed the silence to settle around me. For the first time all morning, there was no audience. No parents pretending disappointment. No sister hiding satisfaction. No attorney carefully measuring every word. Just me. I placed my handbag on the dining table and slowly removed the cream-colored envelope. My grandfather's familiar handwriting stared back at me. open only after they celebrate. I imagined them gathering for lunch already. My father would probably order expensive champagne. Danielle would already be discussing vacations and renovations. My mother would remind everyone that our family had always been blessed. They thought they were celebrating an ending. What they didn't know is that my grandfather rarely left anything unfinished. My fingers hesitated over the seal. For one brief moment, every memory I had spent years controlling rushed forward. The birthdays where my accomplishments barely earned applause. The graduation my parents almost skipped because Danielle had a fashion event the same weekend. The holidays where I learned silence was rewarded more than honesty. The estate reading had not created that pain. It had only confirmed it. A single tear slipped down my cheek before I brushed it away. That was enough. I wasn't interested in crying over people who had mistaken my composure for weakness. Carefully, I broke the blue wax seal. Inside rested 3 items. The first was a folded letter. The second was a certified legal amendment bearing my grandfather's signature, 2 witness signatures, and a notary acknowledgement dated 18 months before his death. The third was a small encrypted flash drive with a handwritten label. For Naomi. My pulse slowed instead of quickening. Grandfather always believed important decisions deserved calm minds. I unfolded the letter first. If you're reading this, they celebrated before asking why. I smiled despite everything. That sounded exactly like him. The letter instructed me to review the amendment before speaking with anyone, then contact Attorney Charles Whitmore immediately. Nothing else. No explanations. No dramatic farewell. Just instructions. Very much like Granddad. I spread the amendment across my dining table and began reading every paragraph with the discipline he had spent years teaching me. Halfway down the second page, I stopped. Then I read it again. My attorney's instincts immediately recognized the significance. The document established an estate preservation clause attached to the family trust. Every beneficiary was required to preserve designated family assets until specific trust obligations had been fulfilled. Commercial properties, community housing, operating businesses, investment holdings. None could be transferred, pledged, or substantially liquidated through outside partnerships before the trust conditions were satisfied. Then I reached the final provision. If any beneficiary knowingly violated those preservation requirements, every affected interest would immediately transfer to the estate preservation trustee. The trustee's name appeared in bold print. Naomi Carter. I read it a third time. Then a fourth. Not because I doubted its meaning. Because I understood exactly what it meant. The inheritance my family believed they controlled was never unconditional. Grandfather hadn't disinherited me. He had positioned me. I inserted the flash drive into my laptop. After entering the password hidden inside the letter, encrypted folders appeared one after another. Board meeting minutes. Trust memoranda. Corporate governance policies. Independent property valuations. Legal opinions. Correspondence documenting concerns about aggressive outside investors. Every file had been organized with astonishing precision. Grandfather hadn't simply anticipated conflict. He had prepared for it. The final folder contained a note. Preparation defeats manipulation. I leaned back in my chair. The weight pressing against my chest quietly disappeared. Not because I had suddenly inherited millions. Because I finally understood the lesson Granddad had been teaching me since law school. Real power never announces itself. It waits. At exactly 4:12 p.m., I called Charles Whitmore. He answered before the second ring. I've been expecting your call. I've reviewed everything. And? The amendment is valid. It is, he replied calmly. We've confirmed every filing and every certification. His confidence settled my remaining doubts. Why didn't he tell the family? Because your grandfather believed people reveal themselves when they think no one is watching. I looked toward the city skyline beyond my windows. They're going to make a move. I believe they will. What do we do? His answer surprised me. Nothing reckless. Silence lingered between us. Then he continued. We quietly activate every safeguard already built into the trust. Enhanced monitoring. Notification requirements. Transaction reviews. Every protection your grandfather authorized. So we wait. We observe. Over the following days, Charles and I worked carefully behind the scenes. No public accusations. Only procedure. Required trustee notifications were prepared. Property transfer alerts were enabled. Corporate records were preserved. Digital access logs were secured. Every safeguard existed legally within the trust. We simply ensured they remained active. Meanwhile, Richard Holloway became a constant presence around my family. I heard about expensive dinners, investment presentations, and promises of extraordinary returns. According to Danielle, Richard claimed he could double the family's wealth within 3 years through exclusive development partnerships. My father admired his confidence. My mother admired his connections. Richard admired something else entirely. Control. Every update confirmed the pattern. He encouraged urgency. He dismissed caution. He spoke as though legal restrictions were inconveniences instead of obligations. They had absolutely no idea they were walking toward a trap they believed was an opportunity. For the first time in years, I stopped wishing my family would choose me. That hope quietly disappeared inside my apartment the moment I finished reading Grandfather's amendment. In its place stood something stronger. Patience. Strategy. Discipline. Love had never been my greatest inheritance. Preparation was. And all I had to do was wait. Chapter 4. The signatures that changed everything. The first agreement was signed on a Tuesday morning. I knew because the automated trust monitoring system recorded the filing at 9:17 a.m. with a precise digital timestamp. My grandfather believed that facts outlived opinions, and every safeguard he designed relied on documentation instead of emotion. I sat quietly in my office overlooking Midtown Atlanta, watching the notification appear across my encrypted dashboard. Pending partnership agreement filed. I didn't smile. I didn't panic. I simply opened the document and began reading every page. Richard Holloway had done exactly what I expected. He had proposed creating a limited liability partnership that would consolidate several family-owned commercial properties into a redevelopment portfolio. The language sounded polished. The financial projections looked impressive. The promised returns seemed extraordinary. That was precisely what made it dangerous. The agreement required the contribution of trust-controlled assets into an outside investment structure before the preservation conditions had been satisfied. My grandfather had anticipated someone exactly like Richard. Someone who dressed greed in sophisticated language. Someone who convinced impatient people that caution was the enemy of wealth. Most people never read beyond the executive summary. Lawyers did. So did my grandfather. I closed the document and saved a certified copy. No phone calls. No warnings. No dramatic confrontations. The trust did not require me to stop them. It only required that every action be documented. That afternoon my father called. "You should come to dinner tonight," he said. "Is there a reason?" "We've got exciting news." "I'll be there." His confidence traveled through the phone. He sounded lighter than he had in years. By 7 o'clock the dining room felt almost festive. Crystal glasses reflected warm candlelight. Expensive wine breathed inside polished decanters. Danielle wore the same victorious smile she had carried since the estate reading. Richard occupied the seat beside my father as though he had always belonged there. "Naomi," Richard said warmly. "Glad you made it. I wouldn't miss family dinner." He laughed. I'm beginning to think you're finally relaxing. I smiled politely without answering. Dinner progressed through harmless conversation before my father raised his glass. To new beginnings. Everyone joined him. Richard placed a leather portfolio onto the table. The first phase is complete. Danielle clapped softly. Mother reached for father's hand. Richard opened the folder and displayed colorful architectural renderings. Luxury condominiums. High-end retail spaces. Private rooftop gardens. The returns will be remarkable, Richard explained. These neighborhoods are dramatically undervalued. I studied the illustrations carefully. I recognized every address. Most belonged to the affordable housing developments my grandfather had spent decades protecting. Families lived there. Children grew up there. Retired teachers. Veterans. Working parents. Those buildings had never been numbers to him. They had been promises. Richard pointed confidently toward one rendering. We'll reposition the properties for premium buyers. I asked quietly, what happens to the current tenants? He barely glanced at me. They'll relocate. Where? They'll figure something out. His answer settled heavily across the room. Nobody else seemed bothered. Father leaned forward eagerly. So when do we close? Richard smiled. Very soon. Then he looked directly at me. You've been awfully quiet. I'm listening. He chuckled. Still thinking like a lawyer. I usually do. He waved dismissively. No offense, Naomi, but legal work is mostly cute paperwork. Investors create wealth. Attorneys just organize the folders afterward. Danielle laughed. Mother smiled into her wineglass. Father never corrected him. Instead, he nodded. Richard understands how real business works. I rested my hands calmly on the table. The law usually matters most after people ignore it. Richard grinned. You corporate attorneys always think documents run the world. They often do. He leaned back confidently. Elite investors respect vision. I met his eyes. They also respect enforceable agreements. His smile hardened almost imperceptibly. You know, if you start interfering with this partnership, I have relationships at firms all over the country. The room grew noticeably quieter. I'd hate to see your professional reputation become complicated. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It was a threat wrapped in expensive manners. I simply nodded once. I appreciate your concern. He looked almost disappointed. He wanted resistance. He wanted emotion. He wanted proof that he had unsettled me. Instead, I finished my dinner. On the drive home, the city lights blurred across my windshield as rain began falling against the glass. At 10:43 p.m., another notification appeared on my secure phone. Additional partnership documents had been executed. I parked outside my building before opening them. Every required signature was there. My father's. My mother's. Danielle's. Richard's. Every page had been notarized. Every filing had been submitted. Every signature quietly activated another provision inside the estate preservation clause. They had absolutely no idea. The following week, I visited one of the apartment communities my grandfather loved most. Children played basketball beside the community center. An elderly woman watered flowers outside her front door. A maintenance worker waved as I walked through the courtyard. The place felt alive. It always had. Then I noticed several envelopes taped to apartment doors. Legal notices. A mother pulled one from her mailbox with trembling hands. Her little boy asked, "Mama, are we moving?" She forced a smile that failed to hide her fear. I don't know yet. Another resident quietly folded his notice and slipped it into his jacket. No shouting. No anger. Just uncertainty. My chest tightened. Richard hadn't mentioned these people during dinner. To him, they were occupancy statistics. To my grandfather, they had been neighbors. I asked the property manager what had happened. He lowered his voice. The new investment group wants everyone out before redevelopment. How much time were they given? 60 days. I looked around the courtyard again. The laughter I had heard only minutes earlier suddenly sounded fragile. This was no longer about inheritance. It wasn't about proving my parents wrong. It wasn't even about Richard. It was about families who had honored their leases, paid their rent, and built their lives inside buildings someone else viewed as profit margins. That afternoon, I returned to my office and organized every document in chronological order. Certified filings, recorded signatures, electronic timestamps, corporate resolutions, property transfer notices. Every piece of evidence entered a secure litigation file. Charles Whitmore reviewed each page beside me. "You've documented everything," he said. "I learned from the best." He closed the final folder. They believe these agreements made them richer. They do. And now? I looked toward the skyline where cranes stretched across the horizon, building futures for some while erasing them for others. Now we let the law do exactly what it was designed to do. Because long before Richard convinced them to sign, long before my family celebrated their imagined fortune, and long before those eviction notices reached innocent tenants, my grandfather had already written the ending. The paperwork had already sentenced them. Chapter 5. The meeting they thought they controlled. The elevator opened onto the executive floor at exactly 9 a.m., and the familiar scent of polished wood, fresh coffee, and expensive leather greeted me like an old memory. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Atlanta skyline beneath a pale autumn sky, but no one admired the view. Every eye in the boardroom turned toward me the moment I stepped inside. I had chosen my outfit carefully. A tailored black suit with understated gold detailing along the lapels. My grandfather used to say armor did not always look like steel. Sometimes it looked like confidence. I carried only one leather portfolio. Everything I needed to change the course of the morning fit inside it. Around the conference table sat estate attorneys, trustees, accountants, commercial bankers, nonprofit directors, independent auditors, and 2 retired judges who served as advisors to the family foundation. They represented decades of professional credibility. None of them had come for drama. They had come for answers. My parents were already seated beside Richard Holloway. Danielle scrolled through her phone before glancing up with the same effortless confidence she had worn since the estate reading. Father folded his hands together. Mother offered a polite smile that felt more like habit than affection. Richard stood as I approached. "Naomi," he said with a grin, "I'm surprised you came. I was invited. I assumed this meeting might be difficult for you. I've handled difficult meetings before." He chuckled and looked toward the others. "She's always been the emotional one." A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the room. Richard continued. "Lawyers love paperwork, but today's discussion is about real business, real investment, real money." His words landed exactly where he intended. My father nodded approvingly. "We're ready to finalize the redevelopment strategy." Richard placed several presentation boards against the wall. Architectural renderings showed luxury towers replacing the affordable housing communities my grandfather had spent a lifetime building. Glass balconies, private lounges, premium retail. Not one image included the families who already lived there. Richard spoke with polished confidence. "Our projections indicate a 43% increase in long-term asset value." He clicked through colorful financial charts. "Outside capital allows us to maximize shareholder returns." Every sentence sounded rehearsed. Every projection sounded certain. They thought they were winning. What they didn't know was that every agreement supporting those projections had already activated the very clause my grandfather expected someone like Richard to ignore. When Richard finished, one of the trustees looked toward me. "Ms. Carter, do you have anything to add?" I stood. Without a word, I walked to the center of the conference table. The room became remarkably quiet. I opened my leather portfolio. First, I placed the original estate trust amendment onto the polished walnut surface. Then the notarized certification. Then the trust preservation schedule. Then banking authorizations. Then certified board minutes. Finally, I connected a small encrypted flash drive to the conference display. One document after another appeared on the large screen. Every signature. Every filing. Every recorded timestamp. I said nothing. Silence settled over the room like a heavy curtain. The trustees began reading. One attorney adjusted his glasses before examining the amendment more closely. A retired judge leaned forward. An accountant slowly closed Richard's financial projections. No one interrupted the silence. Richard did. "This doesn't change anything," he said quickly. His confident smile returned, but only for a moment. "These are standard trust documents." Still, I remained silent. One trustee continued reading. "So does that clause apply to every beneficiary?" Another asked quietly. And a state attorney answered before I could. "It appears so." Richard laughed. "You're reading it too narrowly." Nobody responded. He kept talking. "I advised them to move quickly because delays would have complicated the redevelopment." Another trustee looked up. "You advised beneficiaries to transfer trust-controlled assets before preservation requirements were completed?" Richard hesitated. "I recommended an efficient strategy." "You instructed them to sign anyway," one attorney observed. "They needed to act." The room grew still again. Richard continued speaking, trying to recover. "Look, everyone understands fiduciary language slows transactions." He immediately realized what he had admitted. Too late. One accountant stopped writing. A trustee exchanged a long glance with the retired judge. The silence became heavier than before. Richard cleared his throat. "I didn't mean no," the judge interrupted calmly. "I believe you meant exactly what you said." Father looked toward Richard with visible confusion. "What are they talking about?" And his state attorney turned several pages before answering. "The estate preservation clause automatically transfers beneficiary interests if protected assets are pledged or transferred contrary to trust conditions." Mother blinked. "I don't understand." The attorney looked directly at her. "The conditions were violated." Danielle leaned forward. "But Richard said, the documents speak for themselves," another trustee replied. Father reached for the amendment with trembling hands. He read it once, then again. Color slowly disappeared from his face. "This can't be right." "It is," the lead trustee answered. "You never actually owned those assets without restriction." Richard tried again. "This is a technicality." "No," the retired judge replied evenly. "It is a governing provision." The distinction landed like a hammer. Richard's voice became noticeably faster. "We've already negotiated financing. Investors are expecting closing dates. We can't stop now." A banker finally spoke. "You've already represented these assets as available collateral?" Richard froze. Nobody had asked him that question before. He answered without thinking. "Of course. That's how these transactions work." Another silence. Longer this time. The banker slowly removed his glasses. "So you represented trust-controlled property before confirming unrestricted authority." Richard looked around the room, searching for support. He found none. Every sentence he had spoken was now part of the official meeting record. Every explanation created another problem. Every attempt to defend himself uncovered another admission. I remained exactly where I stood. Quiet. Still. Watching. My grandfather once told me that truth rarely needed help. It only needed time. The lead trustee closed the amendment and looked toward the board secretary. "Please enter the following into the official minutes." Pens immediately began moving across paper. Effective immediately, All pending property transfers, financing arrangements, redevelopment agreements, and investment authorizations are suspended pending legal review. Richard stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. Nobody answered. The trustee continued. Independent forensic auditors will examine all executed agreements. And a state attorney added, relevant materials will also be referred to the appropriate regulatory authorities. Richard looked at my father. Say something. Father couldn't. For the first time in my life, he looked smaller than the chair beneath him. Mother lowered her eyes to the table. Danielle stared at the trust amendment as though reading it might somehow change its meaning. It never would. 2 corporate security officers entered quietly after receiving instructions from building management. One approached Richard respectfully. Sir, we're going to ask you to come with us. You can't be serious. I'm afraid we are. Richard looked toward me one final time. His confidence had disappeared completely. He wanted me to argue, to celebrate, to insult him. I did none of those things. I simply met his eyes without saying a word. He was escorted from the boardroom as dozens of witnesses watched in complete silence. The heavy doors closed behind him. No one celebrated. Dramatic lawsuits. No one applauded. The only sound left in the room was the soft turning of legal documents that had been there all along, waiting for someone patient enough to let them speak. For the first time in my life, nobody expected me to forgive them. Chapter 6. The legacy that endured justice did not arrive with flashing cameras or dramatic courtroom speeches. It arrived through signed court orders, certified filings, and the quiet certainty of the law. 3 weeks after the board meeting, I walked through the marble hallway of the Fulton County Courthouse carrying the same leather portfolio that had become my constant companion. The morning air still carried the cool edge of late autumn, and the courthouse echoed with measured footsteps instead of celebration. That felt appropriate. Real victories are often remarkably quiet. The probate judge reviewed the trustee's petition, the forensic accounting reports, and the certified trust amendment. Richard Holloway's redevelopment agreements had violated the preservation provisions exactly as my grandfather anticipated. Because the trust language was clear and the evidence was overwhelming, the court approved the trustee's request to unwind every unauthorized transaction. Every agreement Richard celebrated was declared void. Every property transferred under those agreements returned to the family trust. Every financing commitment based on those properties collapsed. The estate preservation clause became fully effective. By operation of the trust, the responsibility for preserving the protected assets passed to me. I wasn't handed a prize. I was handed a duty. When the hearing concluded, Charles Whitmore quietly shook my hand. Your grandfather would be proud. I hope so. He didn't build this trust to create winners and losers. I know. He built it to protect what mattered. His words stayed with me as I left the courthouse. The following morning, I visited the largest affordable housing community my grandfather had ever developed. Weeks earlier, fear had spread through those hallways after residents received eviction notices. This time, I carried different papers. The property manager gathered families inside the community center. Children sat beside parents who looked exhausted from weeks of uncertainty. An elderly veteran I had met before recognized me immediately. Miss Carter? I smiled. I have good news. The room fell silent. The eviction notices have been withdrawn. No one reacted at first. People often hesitate before believing hope. The housing trust remains exactly as my grandfather intended, I continued. No one is losing their home because of those redevelopment agreements. A young mother covered her mouth with both hands. Another resident quietly wiped tears from his eyes. Then applause slowly filled the room. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was relief. A little boy tugged on my sleeve before I left. Does that mean we get to stay? I knelt until we were eye level. Yes. He smiled as though I had given him the greatest gift imaginable. Perhaps I had. Walking back toward my car, I finally understood why my grandfather cared so deeply about those buildings. They weren't investments. They were stability. Back at corporate headquarters, the trustees began restructuring leadership. My father was formally removed from every executive position he had once treated as proof of his importance. Board memberships disappeared. Voting authority ended. His office overlooking the city was packed into cardboard boxes within a single afternoon. I happened to pass him in the hallway as he carried the last framed photograph from his desk. He stopped. I spent 30 years building this company. I answered honestly. You helped build it. The distinction mattered. So this is how it ends? No, I replied. This is where accountability begins. He lowered his eyes. For the first time in my life, he had nothing left to say. My mother's world unraveled differently. She had spent decades protecting appearances with almost religious devotion. Charity galas, private luncheons, fundraising dinners. Every invitation quietly disappeared. People who once admired her social influence suddenly found reasons not to return her calls. Status built on illusion rarely survives the truth. Danielle struggled the most with public attention. Luxury brands quietly ended promotional partnerships. Friends who loved exclusive parties found new circles to join. The social media photographs became less frequent. Eventually, they stopped altogether. One afternoon, she visited my office without announcing herself. She looked tired. Not defeated. Just tired. I didn't know, she said softly. I believe that. I thought Richard knew what he was doing. So did everyone else. She stared out the window for several moments. Do you hate me? I considered the question carefully. Hate requires energy. She nodded slowly. I wish things had been different. So do I. She left without another word. Some conversations arrive years too late. Richard's downfall unfolded in public. Regulatory agencies opened investigations into securities representations, fiduciary misconduct, and fraudulent financial disclosures. Civil lawsuits followed. Former business partners began cooperating with investigators. Newspapers that once praised his ambitious developments now questioned every major transaction he had completed over the previous decade. His carefully constructed reputation collapsed one document at a time, exactly as it had been built, through paperwork. People occasionally asked whether I felt satisfied. The honest answer surprised them. I never wanted revenge for its own sake. I wanted preservation, justice, responsibility. Money can rebuild buildings. It cannot rebuild integrity. Months later, the board unanimously approved a long-term preservation plan for every affordable housing property within the trust. Scholarship funds expanded. Maintenance budgets increased. Community centers received new investments. Instead of selling neighborhoods, we strengthened them. I rarely spoke about what happened. There was no reason to. The legal record already told the story. One evening I stood outside the first apartment building my grandfather ever purchased. Children chased one another across the courtyard while parents prepared dinner behind warmly lit windows. Life had returned to ordinary, exactly as it should. I looked toward the bronze plaque near the entrance bearing my grandfather's name. For years I believed his greatest inheritance would be measured in dollars. I had been wrong. His greatest inheritance was the wisdom to understand that wealth without purpose eventually destroys itself. As the sun disappeared behind the skyline, I smiled quietly and turned toward home. Their greatest punishment wasn't losing the money, it was watching me protect what they almost destroyed. Epilogue. The legacy we choose 6 months passed before life finally became quiet again. Not the kind of silence that follows heartbreak. The kind that follows healing. On a crisp Saturday morning, I stood beneath a newly installed bronze sign outside a renovated brick building. The words engraved across it caught the morning sunlight. The Carter Legacy Foundation. For years, my family believed our legacy would be measured by property values, investment portfolios, and invitations to exclusive events. My grandfather believed otherwise. Legacy, he used to tell me, was measured by the number of lives still standing because someone chose responsibility over recognition. Now I finally understood what he meant. The foundation's first board meeting wasn't held inside an expensive corporate tower. We gathered in a restored neighborhood library surrounded by teachers, nonprofit leaders, housing advocates, young attorneys, accountants, and community volunteers. No one cared about appearances. Everyone cared about purpose. Our first resolution created scholarship funds for Black students pursuing law, finance, engineering, education, and public service. The second established a legal aid program for families struggling with housing disputes, probate matters, and predatory contracts. The third committed permanent funding to preserve affordable housing communities that investors had once tried to erase. Every unanimous vote felt like another page of my grandfather's story being written by people he would have admired. Outside, children laughed in the courtyard. Inside, hope finally sounded louder than ambition. A month later, contractors finished transforming my childhood home. The house where silence had once been rewarded now echoed with conversation. The formal dining room became a financial literacy classroom. My father's private office became a legal resource center filled with books, computers, and free consultation space. The grand living room hosted workshops teaching young families about estate planning, home ownership, trusts, wills, and building generational wealth. The walls remained. Their purpose changed completely. Sometimes redemption doesn't require destroying the past. Sometimes it requires rebuilding it. I visited often without announcing myself. Watching parents take notes while teenagers asked questions reminded me of afternoons spent learning beside my grandfather. His lessons had simply found new students. My parents chose different paths. Without the titles they once valued above everything else, they quietly drifted apart. Their conversations became shorter. Their shared ambitions disappeared. Eventually, they began living separate lives. I wish them peace. Nothing more. Nothing less. Forgiveness, I learned, does not always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it simply means refusing to carry yesterday into tomorrow. Danielle left Atlanta before the following spring. There were no dramatic farewells. No public statements. She packed a moving truck one rainy morning and quietly started over somewhere no one recognized her family name. I genuinely hoped she would discover who she was without needing constant approval. Some lessons cannot be inherited. They must be lived. Richard Holloway's story ended exactly where deception usually ends. Court records replaced magazine profiles. Investigative reports replaced glowing business interviews. His name, once associated with luxury developments and ambitious investments, became a warning taught in ethics seminars and fiduciary responsibility courses. The empire he built on appearances collapsed beneath documents he never believed anyone would read carefully. Paper has remarkable patience. Truth has even more. People occasionally asked whether I regretted what happened. I always answered the same way. I regret that it became necessary. Justice and revenge are often confused. They are not the same. Revenge seeks suffering. Justice protects what should never have been threatened. That distinction changed my life. One evening, I returned alone to the apartment community where frightened families had once received eviction notices. Children raced bicycles through the courtyard. An elderly couple sat together beneath a flowering tree. A young mother unlocked her apartment while her daughter proudly showed her a school report card. Life had continued. That was the victory. Not headlines. Not wealth. Not recognition. Ordinary people waking up in homes they no longer feared losing. As the sun settled behind the Atlanta skyline, I found myself thinking about my grandfather one last time. For years I believed he had spent his life preparing an inheritance. I had been wrong. He had spent his life preparing me. Money can disappear. Property can be sold. Companies can rise and fall. Character is the only inheritance no one can take without your permission. So, before I leave you with my story, let me leave you with the lesson it gave me. If someone only values you when you are useful, they never truly valued you at all. If love comes with conditions, it is a transaction, not a family. And if betrayal ever forces you to begin again, let it become the foundation of something stronger than what you lost. Never allow another person's opinion to become the architect of your future. Stand quietly. Prepare patiently. Let integrity become your loudest answer. And never beg for a seat at a table built to erase you. Build the room they can never enter.